We will be talking about what's Apigee Envoy Adapter Quickstart Toolkit. Before that, we will have a quick overview of what Apigee is, what Apigee Envoy Adapter deployment model is, and then we will step into the toolkit, how it will help you in setting up the sample setup that's explained in Apigee documentation. Okay, now let's step into the overview of Apigee. Apigee is a complete API management platform. What you see here is the four main pillars that make up this platform. Starting from the bottom is the runtime component. The runtime component hosts the API proxies that you deploy in this platform, and it has three models of deployment. We will talk in detail about the deploy models in the next slide. And the next one from the bottom is the management services. This is responsible for injecting policies in your API request response flows. So you can inject policies for security, API abuse prevention on the pre-flow of your proxies. That is when the request lands on your gateway. And then before hitting your target backend, you can have a transformations of your payload, or you want to orchestrate with a service call out before you hit the backend. All those things can be orchestrated in this management service component of the platform. Then you have the analytic services. So once you have your API proxies live, you want to measure your developer engagement metrics. How many developers are interested in your APIs and how much is being used. Then you want to have operational metrics. Is your APIs performing with the accepted SLAs that you have set forth when you have this deployment of your API proxies? Then you have business metrics, right? If you have APIs enabled with monetization, with taking advantage of Apachee's monetization capabilities, you want to measure your business metrics of how much is being incurring to the developers, what is the cost or the revenue generated by those APIs. The last one is your API monitoring. Again, this fits into your SLA model of how the deployed APIs are performing. Last but not the least is the developer service components. It sets up the platform for external developers to check out the catalog of APIs, and they can start to play around, test it, and then once they are satisfied, they can subscribe to those API products or APIs, and they start consuming it. And the very critical one is the API monetization capability. So you can have a new revenue stream set up by having your APIs exposed for monetary consumption. Okay. These are the three Apigee deployment models. The first one is the Apigee X, which is a complete SaaS-based model where Google hosts both the management plane or the control plane and the runtime plane. So the APIs owners will be deploying the APIs in the Apigee gateways clusters that are owned and operated by Google Cloud. The customers will bring in their GCP virtual control or VPCs, and the VPCs will be hosting the ingress load balancers that will be directing the traffic to the Apigee management platform that is hosted in the tenant project owned by Google platform. Then you have the Apigee hybrid, where the Google still owns the management plane or the control plane, and the customers own the runtime plane where you will be hosting your APIs. The runtime plane will be running in the Kubernetes container platform, and the runtime plane is composed of multiple services. A few critical ones are the message processors, watchers, and Cassandra. Please refer to the document on more detail about these deployment models and what are all the components make up a Apigee hybrid runtime plane. The last one here is what we are talking in this presentation, which is the Apigee adapter for Envoy. This is an Apigee managed gateway that uses Envoy to proxy the API traffic. So it takes advantage of Envoy's API filtering capability, where it intercepts the incoming request and it enforces an authorization flow and that's where Apigee adapter will be plugged in into those interceptor model, where the request is being handed off to Apigee adapter for enforcing or checking for authorization against the Apigee gateway or the Apigee control plane. Okay, and you can run the Apigee adapter for Envoy in your on-premises or in your multi-cloud environment closer to your target backend. Okay. What is Envoy? Envoy is a layer 7 proxy communication bus designed for large modern service oriented architecture. At its core, Envoy is a L3 L4 network proxy. Envoy is a self-contained process that is designed to run alongside with every application server or in your Kubernetes mesh architecture. The big advantages of Envoy are it supports both HTTP1 and HTTP2. Envoy can operate as a transparent HTTP1 to HTTP2 proxy in both directions. Okay, let me step away from this slide for a second to show the different deployment models of Envoy. As you can see here, one of the main functions of Envoy, it operating as a sidecar proxy in your Kubernetes deployment or in your service mesh architecture, wherein every request is being intercepted by the sidecar Envoy proxies, and then it forwards to the target service within your mesh. Okay, then subsequently you can see Envoy as a sidecar accepting or ingressing traffic from an external application outside of your mesh. The third one is Envoy operating as a standalone outside of your services. Okay, so we will be taking advantage of these three different deployment models, where Envoy is operating as a sidecar, Envoy operating as an ingress, or Envoy operating as a standalone. In all three different deployment models, we will be configuring Envoy to have Apigee adapter as the authorization source for checking or authorizing the incoming request carrying the API key or a JAR token, and those tokens will be verified against the Apigee control plane. Okay, now stepping back into the slide. So this is what I was talking in the on the different Envoy deployment models. So as you can see here, you will be having an Envoy proxy deployed in your data plane or your application, and the incoming request from the client apps is being intercepted by your Envoy, or it lands on your Envoy proxy. And because Envoy filters are configured to talk with Apigee adapter, which takes care of your authorization and streaming all the analytics information back to the management plane. So now you will be leveraging or taking advantage of all Apigee functionalities and benefits by deploying or enabling your Envoy with Apigee adapter in your Kubernetes or in your standalone environment. As we saw in the on the Envoy presentation, we can have this deployment in three different modes. Okay, so Envoy and Apigee adapter as containers in an ASM or Anthos service mesh or a Istio enabled cluster, and your Envoy Apigee adapter is configured to talk to Apigee X or a hybrid. Okay, the second mode is where you have your Envoy and Apigee adapter deployed as native containers, and it's been configured to talk to Apigee X and hybrid. So when I say configured to, it means that the Envoy and Apigee adapter reaches out or communicates to these Apigee platform for authorization and to stream the analytics information. Okay, that's what I meant by configured to. The last one is how an Apigee Envoy helps to talk to the legacy Apigee platform, which is OPDK and AHR. So these are the three different modes where how an Apigee Envoy adapter can be configured with an Apigee platform. So the first one is making an Envoy sidecar proxy enabled for Apigee gateway functionalities. So as you can see in the slide here, the blue box is your pod, where you have both the containers, HTTP bin service, and your Envoy sidecar container operating within the pod. And the request coming in targeted to the HTTP bin service is being intercepted by your Envoy and hands off to the authorization service, which will be the Apigee adapter. So that talks to Apigee X and hybrid to authorize the header information or the payload information carrying the JOTA or your API key. As well, it streams all the analytics information for your target application. In this case, it's the HTTP bin service. The next deployment model is where you have Envoy running as a standalone in a Docker environment or as Docker containers. So you have your HTTP bin as an external target, and your ingress will be addressing to your Envoy Docker container, and that intercepts your request and hands off the authorization back to Apigee and hybrid, and also the analytics information is streamed to Apigee X or hybrid Apigee platform. The third one is the similar setup. The only difference is your Apigee platform is OPDK or Edge. Okay, all these three different deployment models are being explained in Apigee documentation, and they have provided a detailed information of how you will be setting up what you see in these three different deployment modes. Okay, let me go to the one of the documentation where it talks about a Docker native deployment and how it's been configured. So at a high level, right, it have a set of prerequisites where you will be downloading the binaries, having your cloud SDKs installed and your kubectl ready. Then you will have a token generated for your Apigee X or your hybrid or the GCP tokens generated. Then you will be having a provisioning command that generates your Kubernetes artifacts for your Envoy and your Apigee adapter. Okay, so these are the Kubernetes artifacts that are generated. Then you will be applying those artifacts. Then you will be enabling your Envoy filter to inject the Apigee adapter as the authorization source. Then finally, you will be testing your target service by making simple curl commands. HTTP bin is the target here, so making a curl command wherein Envoy will be intercepting the target, and then enforcing the authorization call back to the Apigee platform. So as you can see here, the documentation provided here is having a lot of manual steps that you have to strictly follow to have this end-to-end setup of having an Apigee Envoy adapter along with your Envoy services deployed in your Kubernetes service. Okay, so now what does the Quickstart toolkit does, right? So as I said, it has multiple manual steps for you to set up the sample Apigee Envoy deployment in your environment. It have a lot of manual steps, starting with creating the Apigee entities, creating the GCP project service account and keys, downloading the binaries, generating the config and the template files for your Kubernetes artifacts, and then wiring them all together, right? So, and then also once you have all these things done, completed, how do you clean up all those artifacts, right? That is a missing info in the documentation. And the last but not the least, the documentation is provided for deploying an Envoy within an Apigee hybrid cluster. That will not be the case in your typical scenario, where you will have your Apigee hybrid cluster will be running on its own, and you will have your application cluster separate from your hybrid cluster. So we want to have this separation, right? So the documentation is missing that way of setup where the toolkit will help you in achieving it. Okay. Now let's step into the toolkit, right? Okay. So this is your open source toolkit that you can download, and it have these three different deployment models, and each have a detailed step of what you need before you execute the toolkit. The first one is to run against the Apigee XOR hybrid. So you provide all the projects where your Apigee hybrid is being hosted, your project or the cluster where the GCP project is being hosting your clusters, right? You generate your tokens, and once you have all the open source code downloaded, you are all set to execute the toolkit. Once you have the toolkit, what you have this setup running in your environment. What you see in the Apigee documentation, all the manual steps is being automated using this toolkit. Okay, so now let's step into the demo, right? So here I'm using the second deployment model where you will be setting up a Apigee Docker, Apigee Envoy adapter and Envoy as a Docker containers, wiring it against an Apigee X platform. Okay, so I already have all the environment variables downloaded. I have the binaries for the toolkit readily available. So for example, let me check if my environment variables are all set. As you can see here, it's all set. I have my token already set up. So I have, this is the GCP token. So once I have everything ready, now let's confirm there is no other containers running in my environment. So now I'm setting up the second deployment model, what you saw here. So I'm setting up a standalone Apigee Envoy. When I say standalone, it means Envoy and Apigee adapter running as Docker containers, and I'm doing the action of install. Okay. So there are a total of 5 or 6 steps in total, starting with setting up the service account keys. The service account keys are needed for, okay, I know what is happening. This is because the token has been expired. So let me quickly go and generate the token again. As always, the demo doesn't work when I'm on a screen. Okay, so I have the token now regenerated. So restart the installation again. Okay, so it goes through a series of steps. First one will be the setting up the service account. The service account is needed for streaming the analytics information back to your Apigee platform. Then what you see here is creating the Apigee artifacts, the products and the developer apps and keys. Now I'm setting up the Apigee Envoy and Envoy Docker containers. So now looks like it is complete. Now right now I am in the verification step. The verification step is testing whether the target HTTP bin service is being protected using the API key that I fetch from the Apigee platform. Okay, so now let's step here, right? So talking about the deployment step here, this is what is going on. So you have your HTTP bin target, you have the 2 Docker containers. One is the Apigee adapter and the other one is the Envoy itself. So when we target the Docker container, a local Docker container, issuing a curl command, the Envoy intercepts the request, and because of our filter setup to use the Apigee adapter for authorization, it passes down the header information to Apigee adapter, which turns back and talks to Apigee X to verify the API key, and once that key verification is successful, a success message is being sent back to Envoy, and then only then it forwards the request to my target service. Okay, so now the validation of my setup is complete. So as you can see here, docker ps -a. So I have these two Docker containers running. One is your Envoy Docker, and the other is the Apigee Envoy adapter. Okay, so I am targeting to the port number 8080, which is the Envoy container. So when I issue a command from my local box targeting to port 8080, which is Envoy, it takes the header information and it verifies it with Apigee, and then it confirms that hey, everything is look good, and then it sends the request to HTTP bin. If I send the same request with a wrong key or no key and send it to the Envoy application, it's gonna issue me a 403 saying that hey, you are missing, based on the Envoy filter configuration, it is not able to authenticate this request, and it rejects a 403 back to the client, which is a simple curl here. Let's step into the Apigee platform itself. So as you can see here, it's looking at what I'm looking here is the performance of my HTTP bin service, right? So as I mentioned, the Apigee adapter not only is used for authorization, it's also used for streaming the request, right? So what I'm seeing here is this is the target service that Envoy is using. So that is the proxy, or the name of the proxy, which is the target that's used in the setup. Okay, so you can see here the metrics is being collected on the Apigee platform, and when I step into the developer apps, and you can see here this is the developer app, and this is the key that we are using, GRR. Okay, so GRR is the key we are using, and that's how we know that okay, yes, this has been using the app that is being generated on the Apigee front, and Envoy is using the key from that app to authorize the request in this flow here. Okay, finally, as I was mentioning, this toolkit also has the capability to clean up all your artifacts. So this is the command where you mention action as delete, and now it deletes all the service account keys on the GCP front, and then it deletes all the developer app product information that you have created on the Apigee side. So if I go and fetch, or I go and refresh the screen, it should you will not see the app that you have seen before that's used for Envoy. Okay, so that's pretty much the toolkit, and please do share your comments, and thanks again. Good luck.